to just go through and give some of what we've been thinking about at CEED around energy and equity work. And then we've got a great panel with Tommy, Elizabeth, and Kathy, and I think it's going to be a really exciting conversation after. So you don't have to hear me talking the whole time. And I just want to thank BCLI and Nexus for pulling this together. It's really great to be here. And one of their graduates actually works for CEED, so it's fantastic. So just a little bit about CEED. So we're actually located in southeast Minneapolis. Not southeast. Yeah, kind of southeast. Yeah. We're on Hennepin, like north of Como. And we work a lot on climate and energy policy issues and really looking at community planning, like how do we start to think about energy planning and really looking at things from a racial justice and economic justice lens. And translating a lot of policy issues into popular education, right? A lot of times our communities are not part of policy and decision-making processes because they're deemed to be sort of expert-driven without really respecting community expertise. And so our work is really how do we start to talk about policy in a way that is accessible to community. And then we also work with other like environmental nonprofits and government agencies that are trying to really think about racial equity in a lot of their work that they're trying to do. So today what we're going to kind of start talking about is this intersection between affordable housing, kind of what we think about affordable housing, climate resiliency, and energy equity. And so that's sort of what we're talking about here, and we have a lot of the panelists, a lot of expertise on housing, and hopefully this will sort of frame up the discussion. So this is a map of Minnesota, and what it's basically looking at is this concept of cost burden. And so how many people have heard of that concept of cost burden? Okay. The cost burden household, it's basically when more than 30% of a household income is going to pay rent or mortgage. So just rent or mortgage, 30% of a household's income. And so this is basically the darker red areas are showing a higher percentage of the population pays more than 30% of the income on rent and mortgage, okay? So there's a lot of places that are less than that, but it's still pretty high. It's like 25% is the blue, but the red parts are much higher. And I bring that up because that's just for rent and mortgage, right? 30% of the income. And then when we start talking about energy, so you guys were talking a little bit about the energy pieces that you, so some of the memories that were coming out, right? Like around coal and heating and cooking, right? All of those are kind of the energy uses in our homes, right? And so a lot of the energy that we use is around space heating, air conditioning, water, appliances, electronics, lighting. The reason I put this up, this was actually just shows in 1993 is the first circle and how we use energy in our houses. It was mostly for heating and for like space heating and water heating, okay, for the most part. And what you'll see is that yellow part, which is for appliances. For the first time ever, now in 2009, which is much bigger, a much greater and sort of the appliances and water heating are like the majority of what we use. So a lot of our electronics are actually a majority of the energy that we use in our homes now. First time ever. So when I was talking about sort of a cost burden household, right? So 30% of your income goes to housing and rent. So then on top of that, a lot of energy studies have been showing that this concept of energy burden, okay? So percentage of income is going to rent and mortgage. Then there's a percentage of income that's actually going to paying for cooking, for heating, for electricity, for your appliances, for your phones, etc. Refrigerator, right? And so it basically shows that at a family of 4 at the poverty level, which is about $24,000 annually, has a home energy burden of 17%. So that means 17% of their income is going to pay their energy bills, right? Heating, electricity, etc. And it's actually higher the lower income you are, right? It's mostly because the lower income households have mostly live in a lot of drafty housing, haven't been invested in due to historical sort of investment practices and such. But what you have is even at, it's 200% of poverty level, but double the poverty level, so at an annual income, household income of about $50,000, people are still spending 7% of their income. So it's still significant, right? So, so if you add up your 30% or more burden of household, and on top of it is sort of what people are paying for their energy bills. So, and this is just showing how this is the different fuels. Like we're talking about coal people use. People are using, natural gas for cooking. What do you guys use in your houses for heating? Gas?
Yes.
Okay, somebody have electric?
Maybe in my
Apartment, right?
Electric,
Yeah.
I think.
So, the most dominant source of heating fuel is natural gas, but amongst renters, it's actually a larger percentage of electricity that's used. And that's a lot because it's cheaper to install, right? And so the cost to the person building the house, they put it in is cheaper sort of upfront, but then the people living in it have to pay a lot more for operating it, right? It actually costs more to use electricity to heat your home. So a lot more rental units tend to have electricity, and where a lot of homeowner homes and apartments tend to have natural gas, right? And so what you see, that top line, that orange line, is the price of electricity, okay? It's just been steadily increasing, okay, over time. And this is running from the year 2000 to 2011. Okay, the only ones that all these other ones, you have the blue line is propane. Green is fuel oil that different people use for heating. And then the red one is natural gas, and that price has actually gone down because of this thing called hydraulic fracturing, right? It's like reduced or increased the amount of natural gas available, and the prices have gone down. So you can see the impact then to the people who have had natural gas for their heating actually hasn't been as much to the people that are using electricity, okay, in terms of increasing prices. And what's interesting is that, so our utility, everyone here has Excel Energy as their utility, right? Yeah. And so they just came out, it was just 5 days ago, there was an article in the Star Tribune, and where they were saying that they're still expecting electricity prices to keep rising at about 2%. And even with all the renewable energy that they're going to be adding on, they've really committed to a strong, aggressive push on renewable energy, but even with that, electricity prices are going to keep increasing. So, and that's largely due to sort of larger systems that are being created, that are being installed, and a lot of the transmission costs to build those systems for like large wind farms and things like that. So I know I have a lot of data and statistics, I'm sorry about that. But this is basically just showing that, I'm going to skip this one because it's basically just showing that a lot of energy investments, has anybody taken advantage of the city's energy efficiency, or does anybody have done any work on their house or rental unit? Raise your hand. Hi. Okay. Okay, so a lot of people haven't, right? And there's reasons for that. We'll get into it. But a lot of these programs have been targeted to like big users, so like the big houses, right? The large square foot houses have largely been sort of targeted for a lot of this energy dollars. But what this is basically showing is that the larger houses are on the right, and the smaller apartments and houses are on the left. And they actually, the smaller houses per square foot, so in terms of like how much energy per square that they utilize is actually more, right? Because they haven't been invested in. Like either the landlords don't invest in them or whatnot, right? So while all the money is actually resources have been targeted to these larger houses, it's not necessarily like being targeted to the areas that can benefit from it the most. Because if you add up all the apartments, right, it's actually quite a lot, right? Okay, so this sort of starts to get to it. So this is Minneapolis and St. Paul. So find your house, find your space. Okay, so this is a concept of energy vulnerability that we've been working on that really starts to look at multiple sort of indicators for how do you define an energy vulnerable neighborhood, and how do you start to then allocate resources to that area, right? And so this looks at multiple indicators around housing, especially because a lot of what's happened with programs of energy efficiency and renewable energy, they've gone to sort of this broad spectrum of come one, come all, right? They haven't been necessarily targeted to communities. And so what's been happening is that a lot of those resources have been going to largely the houses that have been ready to receive those funding, right? And so what we said, well, let's look at where are the houses that actually need those resources coming in? Where are these communities that have, okay, a high cost burden, have a high energy burden, right? Like high percent of their income are going to energy bills, to housing. What is the housing stock age, et cetera. If you compile all of these things together, what does it start to look like? And so you start to develop, and we're still refining this. This is just like one of the preliminary ones. But you start to identify certain areas that should be getting more targeted investment, right, in terms of energy dollars, that the housing stock really should start to be invested in more. And we haven't had a chance to map out where the resources have gone. There have been a lot of great programs. The federal government has been pulling down, there was millions of dollars that the state of Minnesota got to start investing in energy efficiency over the past 10 years, not 10 years, the past 4 years. And a majority of those resources have actually gone to those, the blue areas, so the areas that are less energy vulnerable. The red areas are the areas that are more energy vulnerable. As you can see, it's starting to create like a greater disconnect, right? Where you get more of the new green technologies that are being available actually going to areas that, yes, they can benefit from them, but don't necessarily need them, right? And what's interesting is that this doesn't include race at all, right? But if you take those red and orange areas that have a high energy vulnerability, and you just pull those out and you juxtapose underneath it just the racial demographic layer of Minneapolis and St. Paul, what you see is that a majority of those areas that are high energy vulnerability are in predominantly communities of color, just because our Minneapolis and St. Paul are so segregated, right? And so what you've resulted in unintentionally is a race-based policy, right? Like all these housing, energy, solar programs, by not intentionally looking at where there's need and just casting a wide net, they say they're not looking at race, but it is resulting in a race-based policy, right? And so, and it has implications because, especially when you're starting to look at the use of federal dollars, which was used in some cases here, but also which is very exciting, what the city of Minneapolis is starting to embark upon, is with this Clean Energy Partnership, and as Elizabeth will talk about more, and we were just highlighted as a climate champion, right? And being targeted for federal resources with it. It's a really exciting opportunity. There was this, I was going to say, before I get into that. So when I was talking about the race-based policies, it's also in context of historically how housing policy has been administered, right? And this is actually a quote taken from 1950s National Realtors Board. Someone, the housing people will know better, but it's basically their 5 minutes. It's basically their code of ethics. Okay, so it was put out as this is how you should operate in when you're out showing houses. And so it says, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing it to a neighborhood. Members of any race or nationality or any individual whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property should continue to be occupied by the same social and racial groups. So it's part of sort of this is how you do business, right? And so I say that because it's just an acknowledgement of the fact that housing has had a very race-based history, right? And so these things have been institutionalized, and so how do we start to deconstruct sort of the housing racial sort of systemic issues coupled with what has been the ramifications in terms of investment in homes and the resulting energy burden that exists within homes, right? So in 1994, there was an executive order signed by President Clinton, an environmental justice executive order, that basically, and I don't know if you guys know, you can see Senator Wellstone is there. So he was a Minnesota senator who was a real advocate for racial justice and environmental justice issues specifically. And so the signing of the executive order that basically said that any, really looked at tying federal dollars to what the impact, that federal dollars cannot have a detrimental, any federal agency sort of decision on racially based environmental and energy implementation. So it hasn't been enforced that well, but it is on the books, and I'm just going to skip through this. But there's a lot of different policies that I think we need to start thinking about in terms of the impact that's going to be having as Minneapolis starts moving forward. And there is, in Minneapolis, so is anybody familiar with the Climate Action Plan that was here? Okay. So what's interesting about this Climate Action Plan, it was passed like 2 years ago, and it was a really intense effort by a lot of energy and environmental folks to really put a plan together that started to look at, it was looking at housing, it was looking at transportation, and it was looking at waste. So these are the areas that really emit a lot of global warming gases, right? And it's their energy use that does that. And so it looked at, well, what are different plans for housing and transportation especially that we can start to implement? And so there was but there were hardly any people of color involved. And a lot thanks to Councilmember Glidden and other council members that were there at the time. And finally, people of color got involved in the process, and it was an equity lens and a racial and economic equity lens was put into it. And specifically in that now, it says that one of the primary goals is to advance equity in infrastructure and environmental benefits between neighborhoods and communities. And that financial investment should be targeted towards the most disadvantaged communities, and specifically on energy resources. So the city will designate neighborhoods that face multiple impacts of environmental and economic vulnerability, and target housing and commercial retrofit campaigns to increase energy efficiency, boost renewable energy installation, receive targeted city, state, and federal pollution reduction and funding opportunities. This is the first plan in the country that actually really started to do this in any very real way. And I say in a very real way because there's been a lot of movement and a lot of advocates here who have been instrumental in the Clean Energy Partnership that was formed with the city. And one part that was really looked at in the Clean Energy Partnership as a way of achieving equity is this concept of green zones, right? And that was thanks to the Environmental Justice Working Group having instilled that in the Climate Action Plan. And a green zone is really this. It's sort of to target housing and commercial retrofit campaigns on the energy side, at least, to really start to look at how do we start to have a plan for transitioning the housing stock in a way that does not displace and result in gentrification, right, of these communities that have a high cost burden and high energy burden combined. And I say this because green zones have a multiplicity of sort of looking at what a healthy community is, with energy just being part of it, right? Like we've talked about other things that make sort of a healthy community, but energy and housing are a key aspect of that, in addition to other pieces. And I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say too that in terms of this concept of, climate change is starting to hit us, right? Our winters are getting harsher, and we're starting to see a lot more sort of extreme weather start to hit us. There was a tornado north Minneapolis a couple years ago. And one thing that I'm hoping to really, that the Clean Energy Partnership also starts really thinking about, and as the city is moving towards more energy efficiency in our communities and solar energy, they're really thinking about not just like house by house, but like how do we make our communities more resilient, right? I mean, if we were to have an experience some sort of energy services loss, right? Even if we have renewable energy coming from large solar plants or large wind farms, transmission is lost. We lose our energy services. It has a huge impact on our communities, right? Loss of refrigeration. Think about that, right? Spoiled food, appliances, phones can't be charged, communication systems, loss of lighting, air conditioning, elevators, right? If you're just carrying your groceries up, safety, lighting in the hallways, in the laundry room, right? And also in terms of police response, right? I think it was after Hurricane Sandy, they actually showed that the police had a later response to those neighborhoods where the lighting was out, right? Because they thought it was even more unsafe, they could see. And then evacuation of hospitals, other care facilities. So starting to think about, yes, we need to lower energy bills, we need to become more energy efficient and have more decentralized solar technologies, while we are thinking about making our communities more resilient to these impacts. So really targeting it to places that, for example, that might be emergency shelters, right? Like in terms of our schools, just making them energy efficient isn't enough, right? How about having redundant energy systems, like a solar energy backup or something like that in strategic places where we're able to have that on site or in our homes, in our multifamily housing. Thinking about not just lowering energy bills, but really thinking about how do we start to create resiliency in what we know is coming in terms of climate change. So I'm going to end with that.